Okay, so that should be recording. Why don't I see the record sign? Oh, I do see it. Does that thing say it's recording? Okay, it says it's recording. Okay. And there's, okay. Am I more real to you if I'm on Zoom? Okay. Everybody see? Okay, good. All right. So last time we were talking about predator and prey in an ecosystem. I showed you how there isn't a deterministic description of it that gives you the behavior that we see in experiments, and I showed you how one can formulate it stochastically, and so stochasticity recapitulates the population cycles without needing to invoke additional levels of realism. So what I didn't tell you last time is that the way that the ecologists solved this problem was to change these equations to add more physics into it, or more biology. Specifically, they said, well, maybe we need to figure out how it is that the predators actually find the prey, things like this. And so they added extra physics. And the extra physics, I'll tell you what it is a little bit later. But it changed this term here into something which is nonlinear, even more nonlinear, and then it gives you a limit cycle. Okay, Frank, yes, question.
If you're able to quantize, like, because you have to have, quantized numbers of predators and prey, does that help solve this
That is exactly
dichotomy?
how it is solved.
Okay.
That is no, brilliant. That is exactly what we do. And in fact, when I write down these equations here, these x's and y's are integers. Okay, so here x and y are densities, so they're real numbers. But on the big X and the big Y on the right are integers. And then how you do that is quite complicated. So let me just tell you about the physics of this now. Okay. So what you saw from the deterministic equation is that there is a steady state fixed point, which is a constant, not a fluctuating thing. So this is the space of predator on the vertical axis and prey along the horizontal axis. And so a trajectory in here, every point in the space represents a state of the system, and then this trajectory tells you the time evolution. So what you see here is the population decays towards the deterministic steady state. But then something happens. So noise takes the trajectory away from the original path and resets it. So that noise is the discrete birth and death process. The birth creates one more sheep. The death creates one less sheep. The predator makes a baby, you get one more. Those are discrete jumps. And so there's a jump like this. So it's going in like this, it's coming to here. You think it's going to spiral into this, and then it's kicked out, and then it starts all over again. And so this keeps on, that's the noise, and then it keeps on happening multiple times. And so what ends up happening is the phase portrait winds around the steady state, but never gets there. And this corresponds to these cycles here. And the winding period, you can calculate it analytically, is close to the period of a stable complex eigenvalues at a fixed point. So you do stability analysis, just like we did in pattern formation. And the stability analysis tells you that this fixed point has a complex eigenvalue. And the complex eigenvalue tells you that the real part means that you get attracted to the fixed point, and the complex part means that you have an oscillation. And that frequency is close to what you get in such a simulation. And you can compute it exactly more precisely than just doing linear stability. Jan, you're looking puzzled.
Yeah. I'm not sure about what is the meaning of the imaginary part of the egg.
So think of it like this.
It's like the face.
Well, look. So remember that the perturbation goes like e to the omega t. This
Yeah.
is the perturbation in the number.
Yeah.
Okay. And now if there's an omega is equal to the real part plus an imaginary part, then, and this real part is negative, so let's say it's minus the absolute value of the real part times t plus I omega times t. So that means then, so then delta is equal to the real part of this complex eigenvalue.
Yeah.
And so it's going to decay exponentially into the fixed point, and then there's going to be a cosine of omega t from the imaginary part. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so the deterministic motion is damped motion towards the fixed point. Stochastic noise stimulates the deviation from the fixed point, followed by the relaxation to the fixed point, followed by noise, etc., etc. So that's what it looks like. So why did the ecology 101 differential equation picture, the story, the bedtime story that I told you we could tell our children to make them go to sleep, why did that fail? Well, what happens is if I take averaging, by average over trajectories of the system, all of those things will add up to a constant. That's what's happened. And in fact, the full theory of this, I don't know if I'm going to show it to you, the stochastic theory, you can derive the Lotka-Volterra equation as the mean field equations, just like Landau theory. And then you have to go to next order, the one loop calculations, which are 1 over the square root of the number of predators and preys in the ecosystem. And then that's the only way you can get the fluctuations. So you have to look at the fluctuations, not just mean field theory. Okay, so here is just a summary of this. So if you look over here, I'm going to move this over here so that microphone is near me. So if you these are different models that you'll see in ecology books or mathematics books, and they're all wrong except for the bottom one. Okay, so the first one, this is the Lotka-Volterra equations. So this says birth of the prey and death of the predator, and then the predation. So what's wrong with that? So what's wrong with that is that if you then plot the phase portraits, you see these cycles. So you see population cycles, and you say, good, we've solved the problem. So the ecologists are very happy, you have population cycles, but there's a problem. And the problem is the cycle that you're on depends on the initial condition. It's not a dynamical attractor. And these equations, even though they're nonlinear, they have a conserved quantity, like an energy, and you can derive that. Okay? If you want to, okay. So you can derive that. So then you say, well, okay, well, what did we forget in those equations? Well, what we forgot is that there is a finite carrying capacity for the prey. Remember, we talked about the sheep in the field, and there's the sheep, the field is this big, it can only support 100 sheep. Okay, 1 billion sheep wouldn't fit in the field, right? So we had to put that in, and that was this competition term over here. Here's the amazing thing: as soon as you do that, then you just get this fixed point. You get no cycles whatsoever. Okay, so that's bad, and it's very counterintuitive. Okay, it's very, very surprising. So then what did people say? So they said, well, look, you have to worry about what happens. How does the predator find the prey? So the reason we have this predation probability times U times V, prey times predator number, the concentration, the reason is this: we think that they're very dilute. And so the probability for the reaction to happen is the prey has to be there and the predator has to be there. So you multiply the densities together. It's like chemists call it the law of mass action. It's like that. Now let's suppose that there's so many prey around that the predator doesn't even need to go hunting for the prey. Okay, so then what should happen is the predation rate should be independent of what the prey is. because it can't be controlled by it. It can only be controlled by the amount of predator. So what you do is you put in this term, this uv over some k plus u. What does that do? As u goes to infinity, then this becomes u over u, and then it cancels out. Okay, so then it does what I just said. On the other hand, when u is very small compared to this number, then this is goes again back to the law of mass action. And so that was the way that ecologists solved that, and that's called in ecology Holling type 2 functional response. Holling was an ecologist. So the problem with this is it does give you limit cycles. Okay, so it works. Okay, this nonlinearity gives you limit cycles. Limit cycles are periodic solutions which are dynamical attractors. Okay, so that's good. Okay, so that's not a bad thing. But the trouble is that there's no fluctuations. Okay, and we saw that the actual data are noisy, and that noise can be measured. Okay, and they're not. So there's no fluctuations, and so this is that's the reason why it doesn't work, or why it's unsatisfactory. The other reason is we convinced ourselves that the bedtime story physics that led to this description would give you oscillations. It's obvious that it would. And then we did a computer simulation on the physics of this, but just making it discrete rather than continuous, and that produced cycles. So what you learn from that is that you don't need this extra physics, the fact that you have to hunt for the prey in order to eat them. So you don't need that. Even without that, this description does indeed give you cycles, but the differential equation doesn't capture it. Okay, and why it doesn't is a fantastic problem. Okay, actually, it's still not fully solved. Okay, so actually, with one of my students, I'm working on exactly that problem because it turns out to be very close mathematically to what happens in quantum field theory. In quantum field theory, what happens is you have a thing called an anomaly. An anomaly is this: you might start off with a physical system that has a symmetry. In classical mechanics, many of you may have heard of this. This is like Noether's theorem that tells you if you have symmetries and conservations. Okay, so then you say, okay, fine. Now I'm going to take that. So I take the Lagrangian. I see I have some Noether symmetry. Then I quantize the theory. So now the description of nature becomes not a Lagrangian and equations of motion from Euler-Lagrange equations. It becomes the equations of quantum mechanics. I write down the generating functional that generates the probability amplitude in quantum theory. And when you do that, in some situations, the symmetries of the Lagrangian are not symmetries of the quantum theory. Okay, and that's another way that symmetry breaking can occur. Not just spontaneous symmetry breaking like we talked about in this class, but literally symmetry breaking that occurs because of the quantization. And so what we've figured out is that this can also happen in stochastic mechanics, and this is an example of this. And so how can this demographic noise, so this thing that Frank mentioned, taking account of the fact that the predators and preys are quantized, how does that what is the name for that is demographic noise. It's stochasticity in the numbers, the demographic stochasticity. So what you can show is that if I look at the power spectrum of the system, so this system is spatially uniform, so then there's fluctuating in time, and the power spectrum goes like frequency to the minus alpha, and alpha is equal to 4 if you have a deterministic limit cycle with noise, and it's 2 if it is this demographic stochasticity. And then you can look at experimental data. So these things are called, so the things that I'm telling you about are called quasi-cycles. So these are experimental data showing you, trying to measure what the correlation functions are in time. And actually, so these time series turn out to look very similar to quasi-cycle. This one it's not quite clear. Maybe close to limit cycle. I'm not sure. I'll show you other data in a minute. So So that's what we believe is happening in these space independent but time patterns in a interacting ecosystem. Okay. So when does population discreteness really matter? You might say, well, who cares? I mean, there's thousands of elephants roaming the savannah or whatever it is, so then these fluctuations should be small. So it depends what you divide by. If you say, take the number of elephants and divide by the area of Africa, the fluctuations will be small, okay? You're dividing by a big number. If you just sit at one point in Africa and watch as the elephants or whatever it is come past and take statistics, you will find that these fluctuations never get small. Okay, so that locally these things are fluctuating and don't go away. And when you take into account space, there's a correlation length, just like there is in physics, and then you have to look at the correlation volume and so on. So when is the population size is small, then there's a high probability of extinction. So let me give you another thing. If I have my sheep and my wolves in the ecosystem, let's suppose the sheep die out because the wolves eat all the sheep. That's it. The sheep are gone. The wolves a day later will die out as well. That's it. You've just gone back to the vacuum state. Okay, it can never come back. There can never be just a fluctuation and poof, we have sheep floating around. Okay, that doesn't happen. But in the differential equation isn't describing numbers. It's a continuous calculus differential equation. So as the number of sheep goes below 1, the differential equation keeps on going. Number of sheep is 10 to the minus 6, 10 to the minus 17, 10 to the minus 18. Those cycles keep, well, not the cycles, but the behavior keeps on going, even though they've gone extinct. So the extinction is not captured. If you have invasion flights, so you have, for example, sheep over here, they like their field and they see another field over here, so they invade that field. Okay, so species expand their range. This is happening right now because of global climate change. Okay, the world is getting hotter, so things are moving out of the regions of where it's too hot to live, and to regions which are cooler, which are now getting to be more temperate. And so there's a range expansion. Humans are doing it as well. In your lifetimes, the world is going to be turned upside down by global climate change and by mass migrations and so on. It's already starting to happen, and it's going to get worse. Those invasion fronts of invasive species, the population is getting small, and so by definition, the discreteness will matter. And then the other place where it matters is where you have regime shifts or critical transitions. So let's suppose I have a grassland, it's a savanna, there's all sorts of species living there. And now what happens is I have global climate change, I have global warming, the rainfall goes to be too small. Once the rainfall gets below a certain amount, those plants need a certain amount of rainfall to survive. Once the rainfall every year gets below that amount, you get a drought. What happens is that savanna, that grassland, will immediately, everything will die out, and you'll make a transition from a savanna to a desert. It's a desertification, and then the only things that will live there will be succulents or cactuses or something like this. So you have these phase transitions in the ecosystem. That's also happening right now. When that happens, all the things that lived in that ecosystem have no food to eat. So they move. Okay? So these phase transitions have analogies, they're exactly analogous, and it's a very hot topic in ecology right now, how to describe these things using phase transition physics. People have made all sorts of analogies, many of which are actually wrong, in my view. And so this is something that I work on with people at Princeton and there's a lot of activity in this area. Okay, now I want to tell you about something very another thing that's interesting. Let me tell you about the connection with evolution. So I showed you that the predator and prey in an ecosystem, their population fluctuates, and it fluctuates they're pi by 2 out of phase. I gave you last time a heuristic reason where you could see that it's reasonable that it's going to be pi by 2 out of phase. Now I'm going to show you that when there is evolution happening, rapid evolution, that phase difference actually changes. And this is also completely fantastic. So let me show you some data. So let me show you, I'm not going to go into this in detail. Here you can see, let me show you this one. So this one here is a bacteria and phage. Phage is the name for a virus that attacks bacteria. Okay? So the green is the bacteria, the red is the phage, I think. Okay, I may have got it the wrong way around, I'm not sure. So now what happens? So you can see over here that there are these oscillations, and they're roughly pi by 2 out of phase. I mean, not exactly, but something like that. Okay, and then something happens at this time here, 200 hours. And now look what happened. The bacteria are not changing their population at all. Okay, but the phage is oscillating. Their population is oscillating, and the wavelength of the oscillation has changed. Okay? This is called a cryptic cycle. This is data from Rohana Lewinsky in 1999. Here is another cycle. This was this is actually bacteria and ciliates. There's the other line. So this is another. So rotifers can eat algae, and that's another example that happened. Where here you see the predator-prey cycles. You can see that they're 180 degrees out of phase. So how does that happen? So what's going on is that there has been, this point here, there has been a mutation. And a strain of the bacteria has emerged, which is somehow resistant to the phage. Maybe it has a different cell surface receptor, or maybe it is not so attractive to the phage for some other reason, but most likely a cell surface receptor. So then you get these anomalous dynamics. So you have an evolution that occurs, it's like a mutation, and then that mutation spreads through the population. So we're looking here at the evolution in real time of this population, of this mutant in the population, and here are simulations from work on this, showing how the mutant goes to fixation through population fluctuations. And so here you can see exactly what is happening up here, and then here's this phase variation. So this is these cycles. So here you can see the cycles of the phase. These are the cycles by 2 phase, and the same thing over there. So how does this work? So the way you have to write this down is using statistical mechanics. So you can read about it here in this paper. So what you do is you write down, I'm not going to show you this in detail, you write down annihilation and creation operators that describe the processes. The space that they operate on is not quite a Hilbert space, it's a slightly modified space. It's kind of like a Fock space. It tends a product of Hilbert spaces for each different numbers of the species. You can then write it down as a coherent state path integral. You can then work out the theory of these interactions, and that's what we do in this paper. And incidentally, this paper had an interesting review history. We sent it to Physical Review Letters, and at that time, 10 years ago, what the editor would do is they'd say, okay, fine, so this is in biological physics, so I'll make one reviewer be a physicist, one reviewer be a biologist. So the physicist said, oh, this is great, publish a paper. The biologist said, why are all these path integrals and things here? Why aren't they just in the supplementary material, which is where in biology papers, all the math is usually put into the supplementary material because nobody wants to see the math. And so then the biology person didn't see why we had to have all this physics stuff in there. We were sending it to a physics journal. So we sent it to physical review e-letters, as it's now called. It was published there. Okay, so here's another example. So now we're going to add space. Okay, this is truly amazing. Okay, so let's talk about how we formulate this. So the first level of description is what is the probability that there's n predators and n prey in the system at time t. So that is p as a function of m and n. These are integers. So now I can write down all the different processes that happen. For example, if the predators die or are born, then something will increase by one, and something will decrease by one, and so on. So you can work out all of these different terms. I'm not going to go through how you do that. So you can write down an equation like that. It's a partial differential equation for n predators and n prey at time t. There's no space. Okay, and you can see that this is already complicated equations because these m's and n's are integers. They're not. You can't just write them down as calculus. Okay, so now you say, so this equation is called the master equation, or sometimes the chemical master equation, because it was first thought about in terms of chemistry. So then you say, okay, now let's say, what is the probability that there's n predators and n prey at the point R at time t? Okay. So then you'd have to have one of these, but now the P would now depend not just on M and N, but also R. Okay? So you would have a master equation at every point in space. You'd have an infinite number of coupled discrete differential equations. Okay, terrible. Okay, so that would be very hard to do. So what you do is the individuals in the population are quantized. So you use annihilation and creation operators to count them and describe their interactions. So the state of the system is described by M and N. A is an annihilation operator that reduces the number of M's, the prey. B is an annihilation operator that reduces the number of predators. N, I should have forgotten which way around it is. N is the prey, so I said the wrong way around. This is the prey being destroyed. This is the prey being created by an operator B hat. And these operators, you can show the following commutation relations, and then you write down a space, which is a linear combination of all of these states weighted by their probability. So that's the sense in which this is kind of like a Hilbert space, but not quite. Then you can write out the equation of motion for this wave function, this psi, and so there's a Hamiltonian for it. It's just like a Schrödinger equation, but there's no I. And the master equation I showed you on the previous slide, you can show that this is the effective Hamiltonian. So I call it the Liouvillean, or you can think of it as a Hamiltonian. And this idea goes back to Doy in 1976. He had been a postdoc in Cambridge a couple of years before I was there, and then these are some of the earliest papers in this field. And then the paper by Politi. Sometimes this is called the Doy-Politi formalism, but I think it goes back well before Politi. So then what do you do? I'm just going to tell you how you do the mathematics, but I'm not going to go into it. And what you do is you do an expansion around the mean field solutions. So if you have n as an integer and phi is a density, then n over v is the density. So n is v times the density, and then you write down an expansion in terms of inverse powers or v, and then you can show that the probability distribution for these fluctuations like psi obey this equation. It's called the Fokker-Planck equation, and then you get Langevin equations for the fluctuations, and you can look at all. And it's complicated because this is multiplicative noise, so it's there's a lot of mathematics here that I haven't told you, and so these effects may explain patterns of plankton, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. Okay, so Now I want to move on to the spatial patterns. Okay, what do you learn from this? So I told you about Turing's theory for pattern formation last time. So let's go through Turing's theory. So Turing says, I've got two chemicals. He was originally thinking about how you get stripes or spots on some creatures. So his idea was, I have some chemical, which is an activator, and that activator diffuses, but there's another chemical that takes that chemical and tries to reduce its concentration. So the activator creates more of this chemical, or this chemical tries to reduce this chemical. Okay, so that's the setup. And then he said that they can move around, so they have a reaction and they also have diffusion. And so these are called reaction diffusion equations. And then you get patterns because you get local bursts of the activator, and those are kept local by the inhibitor. So let me show you what I mean using the example of a predator-prey. So think about the prey in a community. So the prey the prey starts to grow locally. Then the prey, so the prey here are red. So the black are the predators. So now there's lots of prey over here. So now there's going to be lots of predators over here because that's where the food is. So the predators go where the food is. Then they're going to the predators compete with each other, and they also prevent. They sort of circle the prey, and so they have this predator-prey cycles, but they have them locally. So you get patches that are of predator and prey locally in the system. So if I were to look at the density, you'd see sort of local patches like that, and that's indeed what you actually see. So now let's try to make a model of that. So this is a model that goes back to the 70s. Simon Levin, who's one of the world's most famous ecologists at Princeton, did this work, I think, in his PhD thesis. So he says, let's have a look at the prey, the plankton, and then the herbivores come along and eat the plankton, so they are the inhibitors. So the prey, the plankton bloom, predators, the herbivores come along and eat them, and so their population goes up and down. You get these cycles locally. So now you write down the differential equation. These equations are like the equations we wrote down for pattern formation. These are partial differential equations, just like the ones that we wrote down for Rayleigh-Benard convection. So what happens is you have the reproduction. This is the prey. This is the non-linearities. This is the predation. This is the competition between the herbivores, and this is predation. So this is similar to the equations we wrote down before, but now these things can diffuse with different diffusion coefficients mu and u. So that was the model, and what they discovered as they varied the ratio of the diffusion and the diffusion coefficients and the rate of predation and so on, is that so you can get growth rates which are always negative, so this doesn't grow, and then the blue one is when now I have a band of unstable wave vectors, just like we talked about in convection, and then this is a critical point over here. So you have exactly this mathematics that we talked about for Rayleigh-Benard convection, but now describing this ecosystem. So then you write down what is the phase diagram. So there's the phase diagram, and so here is the predation rate over the death rate of the predators. This is the ratio of the diffusion coefficients. So nu is the inhibitor predation rate, the inhibitor diffusion constant nu, and mu is the plankton, the activator diffusion coefficient. So let's suppose I've got some value here, and you can see that in this range, below this blue line, there are no patterns. This is like the neutral stability curve that we talked about in convection. When you go above that curve, then you get patterns through this Turing instability. And remember, all I told you so far was the linear part of it, the linear instability. Then you can go and work out the nonlinear instability using the methods that I told you about last week. And so this is a problem because you can see that you need huge ratio of these diffusion coefficients, but actually these things are very similar. So the diffusion coefficients are about 1. So then you would never see these Turing patterns. And that's why it's extremely rare to find documented examples where you can actually see Turing's idea working. Okay? It definitely is not true in developmental biology. He didn't know about genetics, and he didn't know about morphogens. He didn't know about differential gene expression, things like that. All of that biology needs to be understood, and that was not included. So that's a big problem. So the mean field theory, which is what it is, it's a deterministic set of partial differential equations, requires a wide separation of scales and diffusivities. This is not true, and so this doesn't really explain what you see in the ocean. Okay, so how do you make it stochastic? Okay, so the basic idea here is that just like stochastic, like in the when you didn't have space, just looking at predator-prey systems, there you had the deterministic equation gave you no oscillations, and then when you made the stochastic theory, it did give you population cycles. So let's make the stochastic theory. So here is the original terms from the 11C model, and then here are the stochastic terms. So P means the plankton, and H means herbivore. And so every term here, just like I showed you at the beginning of this lecture, every term here has a stochastic term, and so you can work out what it is, and then you can work out the master equation, which is equivalent to the mean field theory of the noise limit. So you write this down, and you write it down as a master equation like that, and you work out the probabilities. And so here in the background is some of the stochastic field theory. So let me just tell you what you actually do. So you write the master equation as a path integral. You do the Van Kampen expansion about the task connection corresponding to mean field theory, and you compute the one loop fluctuation, the Gaussian fluctuations about mean field theory, just like we talked about in class, and then you compute stability from this one loop, the normalized theory. So it's quite a nasty calculation, but you can do it. And then what you discover is the following. So this is what I already showed you. This is Turing's original calculation, which from our statistical mechanics point of view is mean field theory. And now you look at the phase diagram when you have demographic models. So this here is still the deterministic chain patterns. This below here is still the stage where there's no patterns. And this gray region here is a region where you have patterns, but they come from demographic noise. So they're the spatial version of those quasi-cycles that we saw in populations. And so the demographic stochasticity changes the parameter range over which you see patterns. The whole thing is now patterns. So it solves that problem. The only thing is that the patterns are not regular. The patterns have some stochasticity, and that means that if I look at the correlation functions, I'll see that in their correlation functions. So they won't be like periodic patterns like the deterministic theory predicts, like stripes or spots, which is deterministic. They'll be scattered in some way. And so you can look at the power spectrum now as a function of wave number and frequency, and it looks something like this. So this in K is where the pattern forms the space, and that is the frequency where you can have an oscillation of the pattern. And in mean field theory, you get no patterns whatsoever. So you can see these things stochastically. Okay, so can you see these things in real systems? So the answer is yes. So after we did that work, a can't remember, 2008 or something, 2009. So so then there were two papers. There's this paper from Joel Stevens at the Weizmann Institute, and this paper with Ron Weiss's group in synthetic biology at MIT. So I'll just tell you about what we did. What we did was we took a biofilm and we engineered the E. coli in the biofilm to have to signal each other, which they do. And then what we did was we put green and red fluorescent proteins on the signaling molecules, so we could see where they were. And then we created it so that this thing activates this, and then this thing inhibits this, and this thing activates itself, and this thing inhibits itself. So this we knew how to do from previous things. So this is how we did the genetic engineering, and then we looked at the patterns that you get in different channels, and they look like this. And then we checked the phase diagram of the system. So this is the difference in the diffusions. These are the parameters. And so what we could see was that these experiments were done in range where you would not see patterns in the deterministic Turing theory. And then we measured the power spectrum, and you could see that it goes like -2 and not plus error, and not -4, as it would do if this was a deterministic pattern. And so that's how we verified the theory. And and here you can see this is a simulated pattern. This is an experimental pattern, and the pattern is clearly has a scale, but it's not a regular pattern. And its randomness has structure, which is what we saw in the correlation functions. So here's another thing that's very cool. You might ask, well, why would we ever see these stochastic Turing patterns? Because you would say, well, the amplitude of them should be determined by the noise, right? In other words, if I've got noise driving it, the amplitude shouldn't be bigger than the noise. Okay, so if the noise is small, then you would think these things wouldn't be observable, but they are. And it turns out that there's an amazing reason why that's not true. So again, I'm only going to just very quickly show you what happens here. So let's suppose I take a dynamical system with some degrees of freedom x. I write that linear equation of some operator x on x. You can think of this as a matrix equation for x being a vector. And when we look at the magnitude, the norm of x is a function of time. So what you would say is, well, we're looking at a stable fixed point. If it's stable, that means that the eigenvalues are negative, and so that any perturbation will go as e to the minus omega-2. So they'll just decay and be small. And so that's what you would see. If you start off with some perturbation, it will eventually die away. So then you shouldn't see any pattern. But this is not true, and the reason is that the fact that the eigenvalues have this character, are real, and so on, is because you assume that the operator has orthogonal eigenvectors, and it turns out that in pattern-forming systems they don't. So the eigen the A has non-orthogonal eigenvectors, and then when you work out the behavior, it does eventually decay to 0, but the behavior in time is non-monotonic. And you can demonstrate this. I'm not going to go into it in detail. And so what happens is even though it's ultimately going to decay, what happens is the perturbation grows, and then it gets into the nonlinear regime, and then gets stabilized by all the nonlinearities. And so you can see these patterns, and you can map out the region in the phase diagram where you see these stochastic patterns. You can see in this example here, for this model system, there's a very small region where you'll be able to see deterministic patterns. For most of the phase diagram, the patterns that you would see are stochastic. So, so anyway, so just to summarize, if the stochastic tuning patterns of noise generated, is the amplitude fixed by the level of noise? No. Generically, the stochastic partial differential equations have non-normal eigenvectors, and so you get a giant amplification of the amplitude, even though the system may formally be linearly stable. Okay, now I'll show you got time. Now I'll show you a real interesting example of this. Okay, so this is the visual cortex. Okay, the visual cortex is a bit of your brain. Okay, so let's talk about your brain. Okay, so what do you see? Anybody see anything? What do you see? Anything?
No.
Okay. Well, that is your visual cortex. Okay, that's the correct thing. Did anybody see this? Did anybody see this? Did you see it when you were just looking at the screen just now? Good, because this is your visual cortex on LSD. Okay. If you take certain types of drugs, or you have some, you get hit on the head by something, some insult to the brain, then you'll see lots of patterns, and they're regular patterns. And there's people who go around and interview people who've had these experiences, and so they're known how to classify what are the hallucination patterns that people see. This is one of the main ones that people see. So that's your visual cortex on LSD. So now you might say, well, where does this pattern come from? And and then the second question we're going to ask is, why don't we see this pattern all the time? Okay, because you're not seeing it now. Well, I mean, you see it because I'm showing it to you, but when I just showed you nothing, you saw nothing. And what do we learn about vision from the rarity of these hallucinations? So what I'm going to show you is that this comes from a Turing instability in the visual cortex. So there's a computer simulation of what the hallucination should look like. So this pattern arises from spontaneous fluctuations of the neurons in the visual cortex. So when you look at the neurons, they are randomly firing, and those firings can create these patterns. So the underlying mechanism is a Turing instability, but it's excited by intrinsic neural noise. It's not extrinsic noise, it's not external noise applied, it's just the intrinsic fluctuations of the system, just like the birth and death processes of the predator and prey are just, what they do. They eat something and kill a prey or make a baby or something. So you should see these patterns all the time because you have these processes going on in your brain, but you don't see them all the time. So why not? Well, suppose you did see them all the time. Okay, so suppose everywhere you looked, you saw this pattern. Okay, but what was in front of you was this. Okay, what do you think would happen to you? You get eaten. Right. So there's selection pressure. Okay, if you see this, that's terrible. Okay, you're going to be eaten by the saber-toothed tiger, some monster. If you see this, okay, great. You see this, then you can run. Okay, so there's an evolutionary selection pressure that you should dial down the hallucination. So what we speculate is that evolutionary constraints have shaped the large-scale architecture of the primate visual cortex. Okay? Okay, so we can test this. Okay, so how do we test it? So there's a mathematical similarity between these genetic models of neural networks and predator-prey ecosystems. Okay, so I'll tell you what that similarity is. So think about excitatory neurons. So there's two types of neurons: ones that cause excitation, ones that inhibit neural activity. So the excitatory neurons are like the prey. The prey activate the predator. The predator is like the inhibition. The predator then stops the prey. So there's inhibitory neurons that stop other neurons from firing. There's excitatory ones that cause them to fire. And then there's some sort of connectivity matrix in your brain. And that connectivity matrix is some complicated matrix. And you could say, well, I've got neurons at different distances from each other, connected by different connections. So if I took that theory as a kind of like an Ising model, and then wrote it down as a Landau theory, and then did the long wavelength expansion of that, I would get reaction diffusion equations. I would get some kind of Landau theory. So you can do that, and that kind of model is called a Wilson-Carroll model. So here's this is the sigmoidal response of a neuron to some external stimulus, and it'll decay, but then it can be excited. The neurons can activate and inhibit each other. So you can write down a two-state system for each neuron. It can be in the active state or the quiescent state. And so this is like an Ising model, if you will. It is spontaneously flipping. And then the excitatory neurons excite other neurons. The inhibitory neurons inhibit each other. And so you can look at these different connections. Okay, and then this visual cortex then is composed of modular columns, and then what you have is long-range excitation connections, and then the inhibitory ones are patchy and are only localized. So basically, you have these sort of regions, these columns, where there's long-range excitatory connections, but they're sparse, and then the inhibitory ones are even sparser and are suppressed with range. Okay, so that is the large-scale architecture. So now let's see what is the origin of it. So remember what we talked about. This was the Turing mechanism. So it's basically like a predator-prey. The excitations don't change identity during transport. So anyway, so you have this kind of analogy that you can expect in the visual cortex. All right, so here are the equations that you can derive. These were first written down by Wilson and Jack Cowan. Jack Cowan's a very famous mathematical neuroscientist at the University of Chicago, who I worked with on this. This is the model that he had written down back in the 1970s. And this model does predict these are reaction diffusion equations for the excitatory and inhibitory neurons. So you can do the whole stability analysis like the ones that we talked about in class. You find the band of unstable wave vectors, the Turing stability, and you can do that, and you can see what are the requirements for that and what are the patterns. Now, what was discovered from looking at this differential equation is that you can look at the symmetries of the linear stability operators, and you can show that the symmetries have eigenvectors that look like the patterns that people observe when they have hallucinations. So you look at the classification of hallucinations that psychologists know, you look at the solutions, the eigenvectors of the Wilson-Carroll model, and they match one-to-one. Okay, so those things are, so these patterns, turns out, are determined by the symmetries of the visual cortex. Okay, so now let's talk about how you make a theory of this. So you may have the visual field like this with a grid that you see in the visual field, but that's not what you see in the visual field. So the visual cortex has coordinates like X and Y like this. But what you see is are coordinates which you see in these radial coordinates, and the map that goes between them is known to be logarithmic. This was already measured many years ago. I don't have it in here. So this is called the retinal optic map that links the patterns and the hallucinations. So let's suppose you take some pattern that is generated by these equations and put it through the retinal optic map. You get this kind of spiral here, this spiral which is more or less deterministic, and that looks very much like the patterns that you see. Okay, so that's not the theory though. So This pattern here is more or less ordered. You can see this is more of a sample order, just like we saw in convection. So you can get this kind of pattern that comes from this. So the known architecture of the mean field Wilson-Cow models does reproduce key features of the hallucinations, but it doesn't tell you what is the effect of noise. It doesn't tell you anything about the architecture of the brain, the global architecture, and the observed hallucinations are highly regular. So you might say, well, let's suppose I make a stochastic theory of this. Okay, maybe the stochastic theory will tell you this, but then the hallucinations are regular. So why aren't they disordered as are the other fluctuation-induced term? So what we did was we calculated the effect of fluctuations. So you have to take the field theory that describes the visual cortex, and then you have to do the one loop calculation for its stability. So let's have a look at that. So we're going to take a model of the visual cortex, and we're going to allow it to be connected in some arbitrary way. Okay, and then the question we're going to ask is this: if I take the generic mathematical model of the visual cortex with fluctuations, does this generalized model allow vision to function in all regions of its phase diagram? So remember what that means, that if the vision is working, then in most of the phase diagram, you should see no pattern. This is the exact opposite of what we had before. Okay, this says you shouldn't have patterns. That's what we want, because we want to be able to see this and not that. Okay, so we're going to ask, are the hallucinations robust with different wiring? Okay, so we make some randomized visual cortex model, and then we do the computation of the phase diagram to one loop order. And so that's quite a messy field theory calculation, but you can do it. Okay, so what you see here on the horizontal axis is basically the range of inhibitory connections, and on the vertical axis is the range of the inhibitory excitatory coupling constant, and then we have these different phases that are shown here. So there's one phase where you have scale invariant instability, which is what I think is where neuronal avalanches take place. Region 3 is the working vision state. So this is the state which is homogeneous. This state over here is the mean field pattern formation state. This is where you would see it in the term picture. And this here over here is where you would see it also. There's two regions in this phase diagram. You see the periodic deterministic regular Turing patterns in mean field theory. And then this huge region over here is where you see the fluctuation driven patterns. So what you want to look at is, where can I go in this phase diagram so that the working vision state is the most stable? The answer is way over here. Here you've got the largest region, and there's two things that this tells you. So the sparse long range inhibition will make the visual state be robust, so that's good. The second thing is the hallucinations that you get are highly regular. So why is that? Well, if you look at you look at the phase diagram over here. So now we're restricted physiologically to this strip, this phase diagram. So let's have a look at what that strip looks like over here. So this is the range of the connections. So you can see you have a homogeneous state, then you have the irregular quasi-patterns, and then you have the highly irregular Turing patterns. So the question is, well, how do the hallucinations skip this irregular phase? You go from being able to see to being able to see to seeing just a regular deterministic pattern. So what happens is, if I have a generic visual cortex network, then there will definitely be this intermediate regime which will give you these irregular patterns. The real visual cortex goes from no patterns to something like this. And so the reason is that you're looking at that very small region over here, where you have sparse long range inhibition. So just by having this region of having this architecture, you have two length scales, the long one from between the modules, these columns, and the short one. The long range connections originate only from excitatory neurons. The inhibitory ones are patchy and suppressed with range. So this architecture minimizes the range in the region in the phase diagram where you see the spontaneous fluctuations giving you rise to persistent hallucinations. So it seems that evolution has chosen the structure of the visual cortex in such a way as to minimize the hallucinations because there's selection pressure against having hallucinations. Okay, so what have I told you? That stochasticity can give population oscillations and spatial patterns in situations where they cannot exist deterministically. You don't need to fine-tune the parameters, there's less parameters, and then it gives you a correct treatment of fronts, spatials, boundaries, critical transitions, and rapid evolution. Stochastic tuning patterns can be observed in the laboratory, and the suppression of generically expected stochastic patterns by the architectural sparse long-range inhibition yields the functional state of the visual cortex. And so there is an evolutionary selection pressure in achieving this state. And this isn't our work, but other people's work identified how the visual cortex can be plastic so that the evolutionary pressure can actually change the architecture over evolutionary time and yield this result. So that's it. That's the biological pattern formation metric.
How did we, just remind me, how did we explain the jump over the irregular patterns?
We explained it because the region of the phase diagram. So if you're in this region and then you get hit on the head, you're going up this diagram here, so you're going up into this region. If you were over here, you got hit over the head, you go up into this region. You see where the irregular.
Okay, so it's saying that the. Okay.
So because this region this is bigger than this, so this is where you've got the best chance to see real vision. And then if you get perturbed, then adjust this coupling constant, and then you'll go into this state here.
So it's when we have the x coordinates getting really far to the left. Like
yes,
really.
That's right. The opposite. Yeah. The real visual cortex would be operating in this region of the phase diagram. And then if you get hit on the head, you go up this way, because you're going to be then going into this region 5, which is the region where you have deterministic prediction. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's a prediction. You can calculate it. It's a testable hypothesis. It's like it's amazing, right? That you use quantum field theory to test a hypothesis in evolutionary neuroscience. Okay, so now I've told you all about pattern formation. So do you want me to tell you all about turbulence?
Yes.
Okay, I'll tell you all about turbulence. I won't tell you all about it. What I'll do is this: I will show you a talk that I gave very recently. I could tell you more about biology, but I'll tell you about turbulence.
I have like a quick question.
Mm-hmm.
Like for all these questions, since you apply very similar methods on the pattern formation, so I guess most of them are like the based on the like the predator and the prey model. So I was wondering what kind of question could be solved by those methods. Like there must be some like a quantity that are competing, or
So the problems that I've looked at are mostly ones, so if you have a pattern, then there have to be things that compete.
Yeah, but everything has a pattern.
I agree. So you can apply this to lots of different things. But you have to know what are the variables that compete, and then identify those, and then make the theory for those. But I'm going to show you an example now where you can apply this to turbulence. Okay, so as you say, everything has a pattern. So everything has things that compete. So I mean, there's other ways you can apply these methods. I mean, we're just doing these things because these are the obvious problems to work on, and we were interested in them ecologically. But okay, so I'll tell you about this. So this is a talk. Do people mind if we go over this? Okay. If we get kicked out, then too bad. Okay, here's what I'm going to tell you. Okay, so this is very short. If you want to see this talk in full detail, it's on the internet and on YouTube and many places. Because I gave this talk during COVID and things like this, and people recorded it. Okay, although this talk is new. Okay, so here's a pipe, and there's a thing called the Reynolds number, which is the velocity of the flow, the scale of the flow, that's the pipe diameter, divided by the viscosity. And that's the Reynolds, that's the control parameter. So if the Reynolds number is low, then the flow is laminar. If the Reynolds number is high, then, which can happen because the viscosity is small or the speed is high, then you will get turbulence. And in between, there is some sort of transition. And that people have been studying this transition since 1883. You know what? Let me do this. Let me not give you this talk. Let me give you a more introductory one. I'm not going to give you the whole thing, because that talk was written for a conference I was at the other week. Because Professor Srinivasan was being honored, and I was asked to give one of the talks, and he's one of the world's experts on turbulence, maybe the world expert. So the talk is really intended for experts. Okay, so this is this talk. Yeah, I'm going to skip the propaganda. Okay, so these are Navier-Stokes equations which we talked about in the class. This is the Reynolds number, this is the kinetic viscosity, and this is the phase diagram I showed you before. Okay, so when I talk about the life of turbulence, I mean how it behaves, and then when I talk about the death of turbulence, well, I talk about how this transition happens. This part over here was work that we did in this nature physics paper. This part over here is work that we did in this nature physics paper, and there was a new one that was just published last week or this week, which you can read about as well. Okay, so what does it mean to solve turbulence? Okay, so if you ask a physicist, they'll say, well, turbulence is fluid doing this, right? So I should be able to predict the fluctuations at small scales, which is where the fluctuations occur. Okay, so that's what a physicist would say. So let's see what actually happens. So let's suppose I look at the energy spectrum. So this E of K is the kinetic energy per unit wave number range. Okay, so that's what it is. So if I plot the logarithm of that against wave number, it looks like this. There's something that happens up here at small wave numbers. That's where you put your fingers into the bathtub and stir them in. This over here is a high wave numbers, small length scales. This is where the fluid friction from the viscosity starts to matter, and the fluid heats up, it generates heat, and the energy is lost. And in between, there is this process where I get swirly-whirly things called eddies, which nobody knows how to define precisely. And these swirly-whirly things do this. There's a swirly-whirly thing that does this, and then it spits off another swirly-whirly thing, but it's slightly smaller. And that swirly whirly thing, which is slightly smaller, spits off an even smaller one, and so on. Okay? And the thing is, that process, that spitting off these smaller and smaller edges, is a Hamiltonian process. Now that's not obvious. Okay, it was a guess made by Richardson in the 1920s, and then mathematized by Kolmogorov in the 1940s. And so this process is not just the fluid just winding down like the wheels falling off a bicycle. This is actually the dynamics of vortices. And when you simulate it, that's exactly what you see. In this region here, this whole process is called a cascade. Okay? So what did Kolmogorov do? He said, well, if it's a Hamiltonian process, then the viscosity doesn't enter into the equations of turbulence. It's like a superfluid. Energy is transmitted from scale to scale, from small k to large k in a cascade, and the energy is not lost in the intermediate steps. Okay, so that's very unusual. Putting energy in at large scale, it disappears at small scales. In between, the energy just cascades through. Okay, so here is a brilliant idea that Kolmogorov came up with. And sometimes in books or seminars, you'll hear people say, oh, you can derive this law by dimensional analysis, but it's not true. It's completely wrong. Okay, so let me explain what is the claim. I want to know what is E of K, kinetic energy to unit weight number range. Depends on K. Depends on epsilon, which is the rate at which you're putting energy in, how fast you're stirring your fingers in the bathtub. It depends on this kinematic viscosity, nu, and it depends on how big the system is, because the Reynolds number depends on how big the system is. Okay? Out of these parameters, and there might be, say, the pipe radius or something like this. Out of these parameters, I can make a length scale called the Kolmogorov length. It's nu cubed over epsilon to the 1/4. That is dimensional analysis. So then I can say, if I know dimensional analysis, then I can simplify the equation. So now this is a function of u squared over eta k, and then now a function of two variables, k eta and k l. Eta is a length, so k eta is dimensionless. K L is a length, k is a wave number, so that's dimensionless. And this thing over here is the quantity that has dimensions of kinetic energy. Okay? So the dimensional analysis says that if you have a theory of turbulence, it will produce a formula like this, and the theory of turbulence will tell you what this function is. Okay. Now we're going to say, well, let's look at the system. We're going to keep K the same, and now we're going to imagine that L is getting larger and larger. So we're looking at small scales into the system. So you could say I fix L and then I make K go to infinity. So I'm looking at large K. Remember over here, the behavior that we're seeing is at high wave numbers. There's not small wave numbers, so it's high wave. So this is opposite to critical phenomena. In critical phenomena, you think the universal phenomena happens at long wavelengths. Here, the universal phenomena happens at small wavelengths, where you see the velocity fluctuations. So let's take KL to infinity. So now we place KL by infinity. So that's great. This F is a function of two variables. Now it's just a function of one variable. This one over here. So now you say, okay, fine. Now, if I want to get a fluid to be really turbulent, I should make nu go to 0. Okay. If I make nu go to 0, I can do that. If nu goes to 0, then eta will go to 0. But I've got nu on the outside over here, and I have eta on the outside over here, and I have nu in the inside here. So the trouble is that nu happens in here, and this happens in here. And what we want is something that doesn't depend on the viscosity. Because the hypothesis is that the process is Hamiltonian for this cascade, so it shouldn't depend on the viscosity. So the only way that it cannot depend on the viscosity is if this function is a power law function, so that the powers of the viscosity is on the outside here, which are nu squared, and then the viscosity coming from this, 3/4 coming over there. That viscosity dependence cancels out of what's inside here. So this function f must, at least for large, for small values of its argument, must be a parallel function. So you work out what parallel function it has to be and cancel the viscosity. And the only way it cancels is if this E equals to some function, a constant, times epsilon to the 2/3 k to the minus 5 things. Okay, it's fantastic. Okay, it is a brilliant argument, and it's pretty much true. Okay, it's not completely true. Okay, all right. So that's this assumption that these limits exist is what we call complete similarity. So those of you who were in my class last quarter, remember I showed you how you can get anomalous dimensions in partial differential equations. And we talked about complete similarity when we take an asymptotic limit and that limit exists. And then we take an asymptotic limit and it doesn't exist, and that's called incomplete similarity. Okay. So this assumption is one assumption you can make, and you get that. And this is what the data look like. So you have either k looks something like this, and this is parallel, and then the dissipation. And that's what people think happens, and that's called the inertial limit. Okay. There's a problem. This limit is not complete similarity. If I take KL goes to infinity, this limit doesn't exist. Okay. So how might it not exist? So those of you who went to my class last quarter on phase transitions in the normalization group will know one way that it won't exist. What it can happen is that this function, f of k, e to k, kl, actually looks like this limit is multiplied kl to some power, and then a function that just depends on this first argument. So that if that happens, then taking this limit will cause e to go to infinity or to zero. So this limit doesn't exist, so you have to just not take that limit and just look at the asymptotics of this. So if you do it like that, then it says that then your scaling law, k to the minus 5/3, gets modified by k to the power eta. And this is an anomalous dimension, just like in the normalization group for phase transitions. Okay. So that's called the similarity, the intermittency exponent. And so Commodores' argument is not quite correct. Okay. Another thing that you might ask is this. What is the frictional drag when I have turbulence? So normally you would say, now if I'm a car, I'm walking through air, the friction I experience is going to be definitely proportional to how fast I move. Right? So you might say that the frictional speed is proportional to the velocity. Okay? But it's not true. Okay? It's true for small velocities, but when you're turbulent, actually what happens is that the friction goes like the velocity in the Laminar range, and it goes like u squared in the turbulent range. Okay? Where does that u squared come from? The first paper I know that predicts u squared was by Isaac Newton from Principia. He guessed this. It's amazing. Okay. Okay. The people who really, and he had a kind of weird explanation for it, which I don't know if it makes sense. The people who really discovered this for sure were French engineers in the 1700s who were trying to dig sewage canals in Paris, and they measured. They were good engineers, and they measured how fast water flows through a canal depending on its, how sloping it is, and they could see that the friction went as the velocity squared or something like that. So this friction factor here, I'll define it later. I will get to it. But this is basically pressure drop divided by the velocity squared. Okay? So F is the pressure drop across the pipe divided by the velocity squared, so times some constant. So just illustrate that. Okay? So that's what Nicorazzi measured in 1933. This range here this slope is 1 over Reynolds number. So since the friction factor goes like 1 over u squared, if the pressure drop, the drag, is proportional to the velocity, then it should go like 1 over Reynolds number. And so here, this is a log plot, and this slope here does go like 1 over Reynolds number. This over here, this is going as a constant, independent of Reynolds number. So that shows you that the friction in turbulence goes like u squared. Because it's a constant when plotted in this way, so it means it goes like u squared. Okay, then in between, you have all this weird non-monotonic behavior which you have to explain. Okay. So what you might say is, can you predict the dissipation from knowing the fluctuations at small length scales? So if I know this picture of the cascade, can I predict this? Okay. And that's a physics question. And we answer this, and the answer is yes, you can. Okay, so I'm going to skip the phase transition stuff, which is very cool. Maybe if you want, I can give you a lecture on it later. Okay. So let me just tell you about this. So these different scaling regimes look like that. Laminar is the purple, green is the Blasius regime is called. This slope here is Reynolds to -1/4. And what I didn't tell you was this data set was taken with pipes with varying degrees of roughness. So what the experimentalist did was he took pipes and then he glued sand grains to the outside and he varied the diameter of the sand grains. Okay, this is a very tricky experiment to do. Okay, and then he changed the ratio of the roughness of the sand grains to the radius of the pipe. And so what he found was the smoother the pipe was, the smaller was the friction, just as you would expect. And then they discovered that if I look at the value here as a function of Reynolds number, it doesn't depend on the Reynolds number, but it does depend on the roughness, and it goes like the roughness of the pipe diameter to the 1/3. Here, this line over here, all these pipes with different levels of roughness, they all initially follow this line, which goes like Reynolds to the -1/4. And the smooth pipes follow it much further than the rough pipes. The rough pipe starts off and very quickly goes away from it. Smooth pipe keeps on going, keeps on going. Eventually, you start to see some roughness at very high Reynolds number. Okay. So the question we want to understand is this a critical phenomenon? Okay. So you remember last quarter we talked about data collapse. Do I have it here? Yeah, here's data collapse. So there's two things. One is looking at correlations of phase transitions. So say the 2-point correlation function goes like k to the -2 or something like that. The correlation function for the velocity fluctuations goes like k to the -5/3. I showed you that. That's Kolmogorov's law. We know there's data collapse in thermodynamics. So here's data collapse. So I take the magnetization as a function of temperature and external magnetic field H. I scale the data in the way that the normalization theory predicts, and all the data, M as a function of H and T, should function on 2 variables, just depends on 1 variable. The data all collapse into 1 universal curve. And that's a normalization group prediction with no adjustable parameters. Okay, so what I did was I said, okay, let's see what happens if we think that turbulence is a critical phenomenon. So there's a critical point at Reynolds number equals infinity, roughness equals 0. It's singular in the roughness. And then you can work out, by a kind of argument like the Kazanov-Bloch spin method, you can work out that the friction factor should have this functional form. Okay? So it goes, it's a function of 2 variables, Reynolds number and roughness, as you can see over here. And if you work out the theory, you get a formula that looks like this, and this eta is the intermittency exponent I told you about before. Okay, the one that is the slight deviation from Kolmogorov. So then Rafal and Portolani took this idea, and they took the experimental data, and they, well, what I had done was I, first of all, I said the eta is very small, so they ignore eta. And I showed these different types, and then everyone that's around me, I had included eta in the calculation, and then redid the plot that I did. I showed you the work plot, the pie plot, and the data. All of these data will play out into one universal code. And from that, you can extract a value of eta, and you get a value that's consistent with what we already know from wind tunnel measurements. So this tells you that fully developed turbulence is a state which has a scaling, just like phase transitions do. Okay, and this is incredible. Okay, this is truly astounding. Because Nicolanti in 1933, all he did was measure the pressure drop across a pipe. He was a great engineer. He did this very, very carefully, and he by accident measured the anomalous spectral exponent of turbulence. And he did this in 1933. Kolmogorov didn't even guess the mean field theory until 1941. The whole field theory of turbulence, we still don't know how to do it. Okay, although we've made some progress on that. So the thing is this, now we've got a connection between the friction, the dissipation, and the intermittency connections, and the intermittency connections tell you about the velocity fluctuations. So now what this work is showing you, this tells you, this data kind tells you that there is a non-equilibrium version of the fluctuation dissipation theorem. Velocity fluctuations tell you about drag friction, drag dissipation. And so that just like there's a fluctuation dissipation theorem in equilibrium statistical mechanics, we can see it in these data. And I was very lucky. I was the only person to look at the experimental data from this engineer in 1933 who knew about the normalization group theory and stuff like this. Okay, so I'm going to skip this. So we did work out with my colleagues at Illinois, Gustavo Joya, Chapter 40. We worked out some kind of very hand-wavy, hokey theory that predicted these Strickler and Glazer's experiments. I'm not going to go through how it works out, but you can do it. Okay, so and it's not tremendously believable, but there's something true about it. And here's how I know. We tested this in 2 dimensions. If I have turbulence in 2 dimensions, then you have this energy cascade that I told you about, Richardson's energy cascade from large scale to small cascade. In 2 dimensions, it goes the other way. Energy goes backwards, goes from small to large. It's called the inverse cascade. And angular momentum is another conserved quantity in 2D. So angular momentum, specifically what's called entropy, the square of the vorticity, has a cascade to forward direction. Because it has different dimensions than energy, the power law for the energy spectrum goes like k to the -3. There's logarithmic corrections that looks like that. So we've got a theory that says, I can tell you what the friction that you're going to observe is at different Reynolds numbers if you tell me what the energy spectrum is. So now the question is, can I make 2-dimensional turbulence in the lab? Can we test this prediction? Here is a prediction. Okay? Can we test it? So we made a 2-dimensional pipe. So here's a 2-dimensional pipe. So you take, here's a picture of it. You take, and this is a very expensive experiment. It costs like $7. Okay? You go and buy fishing wire and liquid detergent from Walmart. And the fishing wire goes up there, and you see it there. And then you get some salt grates, then it's a rough wall, and then you put soap and water in here, and it flows between them. So you get a 2-dimensional soap film. The water flows down here, and then you put the salt grates on the outside. And so that's the cheap part of the experiment. The expensive part of the experiment is you put little particles into the washing up liquid, and then you use a laser to scatter light off them, and then you do laser Doppler velocimetry to measure what is going on. So here's an experiment where I have this 2-dimensional soap film. I put a fork, again, like 99 cents at Walmart, or for free from the food counter, and through the soap film, you can see the turbulent vortices created over here. You do laser Doppler velocimetry, and you can see that the energy spectrum is going as k to the -3, just as I told you. Okay. Then I can do a different thing. I can put one saw blade on this side and smooth on this side. And I measure on this side. Okay, so I see the energy spectrum goes as k to the minus 5/3. Okay, so I can create these two different cascades in the laboratory. So now is the question. Now I can measure the friction factor. So I can measure the friction factor because from my laser Doppler symmetry, I can measure the fluid velocity as it flows through this soap film. Then from the velocity profile, I can construct what the friction is. And that's what you get. So what we predicted was when you have the inverse energy cascade, k to minus 5/3, the friction should go like it does in 3D. There's what I call the Blasius law. Friction should go as Reynolds number to the minus 1/4. When you go to higher, when you go to the entropy cascade, which goes in the opposite direction, goes from large to small, then it should go like Reynolds to the minus 1/2. That was the prediction. So here you are, the inverse cascade Reynolds to the minus 1/4, the entropy cascade Reynolds to the minus 1/2. So we did the experiment, and that's the data. So it worked. And then about 10 years later, Hamid Kelly, who was one of our main experimental collaborators, was actually able to push this into the regime where the friction becomes independent of Reynolds number, just depends on the roughness. Remember what we had here, this prediction was that in this regime where you see the Reynolds to half, this parallel should be 1. That was the prediction. Okay, so when you did the experiment, and you can see here is the friction as a function of roughness going out the first power, and here is the data collapse curve, which is friction factor times Reynolds to half, then roughness times Reynolds to 1/2 in this way. This is the analog of the data collapse that I showed you for the 3D pipe, and you can see for the 2D you get the data collapse as well. So what this tells you is that in turbulence, the drag at large scales reflects the very nature of the turbulent state at smaller scales. We make 2 predictions. Actually, we made 3, all confirmed experimentally. Okay, so what I didn't tell you about was this critical point here. This critical point here is the Lyman turbulent transition is actually a non-equilibrium phase transition. And we figured out what the universality class of it was, we measured the critical exponents, and we measured the universal scaling functions, and it agrees exactly with the theory. Okay, so 2:10. Shall I tell you about the experiment, the theory? I guess there's no class in here, right?
I guess not.
Do you want to keep going? It won't take very long. Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. This is very cool. Well, I'm biased, obviously. Okay. What day is it today? Wednesday. Am I supposed to be doing anything right now? Let me just check here. Okay, I have to meet a student at 3, so. Okay, so this is Mr. Reynolds. We made the Reynolds number, 1883. And there's this pipe over here. What he does was he injects dye ink into the pipe. And then the pipe, if the flow is laminar, it's just smooth. If the pipe is turbulent, it gets jagged. And if it's turbulent, what it does is this: smooth, then turbulent, laminar, turbulent, laminar, turbulent, like that. Okay, that's a very weird thing. He called these things flashes, but we call them puffs today. So that's what he discovered. So you can ask the following question: how much turbulence is there in the pipe? So here's his pictures. Here's a Reynolds number. Here's the turbulent fraction. So I just look at how much of the pipe is full of turbulence. And then I plot the fraction, and I get this curve over here. Okay, so that's experimental data. It's not quite on a pipe, it's on something slightly different, but morally it's the same thing. Okay, so this looks like an order parameter, like the magnetization. This looks like the correlation function. So you might think there's a connection between the transition to turbulence and continuous phase transitions. You might think that, but let's see if it's true. So, okay, why are phase transitions hard? Okay, so we did this in the first quarter of this course. So what we learned was that phase transitions have an order parameter. The order parameter near the transition is strongly fluctuating, and it's non-Gaussian, and it is intermittent, so I can measure it for a good distribution that looks like this. And the odd thing is that we write down Landau theory, and we ask, what is the small parameter when we look at a phase transition? And I say there's no small parameter. And you say, ridiculous, of course there's a small parameter. T minus TC over TC. As I go towards TC, this parameter gets small, right? It's true. Trouble is, it's not a usable one. Why not? Here's what happens. We did this last quarter. Here's Landau theory. If I rescale the theory, and we did that in class, you weren't here, but we did it, then what it turns out to be is that you can rescale it, so this thing becomes 1, this thing becomes 1, and this thing becomes a quantity called U0 bar, and it behaves like T, this little t, to the power d minus 4 over 2. So when d is less than 4, that means as I get close, as t goes to 0, this thing actually goes to infinity. So the interactions go to infinity as I get close to the transition below 4 dimensions. They don't go to 0. Okay, so it's mind-boggling, right? There's a small parameter that's not usable. Okay, now look at turbulence. So turbulence, if I look at the velocity fluctuations, they look kind of Gaussian, but nobody cares about velocity fluctuations. What you care about is the difference between the velocity fluctuations over here and the velocity fluctuations over here, because that's the thing that shears you and makes your airplane suddenly fall to the ground and your boat sink or something like that. When you look at the derivatives of velocity, they are very non-Gaussian. And they look like that. You have no small parameter. Well, of course you have a small parameter. Nu goes to 0, and something goes to infinity. But that small parameter comes in here. So the ratio of this coefficient to this, which is 1, this nonlinearity, always gets big as you go towards the phase, as you go towards turbulent flow. So turbulence at a high Reynolds number is like a phase transition at a critical point. The viscosity going to 0, the Reynolds number going to infinity is like temperature going to TC. That's why I worked out the theory that was that data collapse. Okay, so that's why turbulence is still an unsolved problem. And we know how to solve this one. That's what the normalization group is. That's what I've been spending the last 10 years or 20 years working on turbulence and solving it. Okay, so let's do a Reynolds experiment, but let's do it in the 21st century version. So this was done by my undergraduate, Bjorn Hoff. So here are data from 2008. So what you do is you take a pipe, make it flow laminar. It's absolutely stable. Turns out that the laminar flow is stable. So you then say, well, let me hit it. How do I hit it? I inject a bit of fluid into the flow. That bit of fluid creates some turbulence, and then you can ask the following question. Turbulence is now going to flow down the pipe. Here it is in yellow, and then it's going to come out the other end, and I can see how fast it's going at the other end. Now, actually, this graph here is showing you the velocity profile across the pipe. If the flow is turbulent, this profile is a parabolic profile. If it's turbulent, so if it's laminar, it's parabolic. If it's turbulent, it's much flatter, and it has more turbulent drag. So it has turbulent drag. When it comes out the other end, it goes slower. So turbulence, if it gets to the other end, comes out with a red. Not turbulence, when it comes out the end, comes out yellow. The yellow curve. I know how far away this is. I know how fast the fluid is going. So I know how long it takes the little puffs to get there. So basically the experiment is this. You've got the fluid, it's stationary. You create some turbulence. Here's the turbulence. It wanders down the pipe and maybe it just dies before it gets to the other end, in which case the flow comes out with the yellow. But if the turbulence still exists, when it gets to the other end, and it follows the drag, and it will come out in the red one. I do this many, many times, and so I can measure the survival probability of turbulence as a function of Reynolds number. Okay. So what you do is you then measure that survival probability, and you find it goes like e to the minus t over time. It's a Markov process. Okay? Memoryless process. That's what you get like a Poisson process. Very strange. And then you can measure that exponential decay. So here's some of the early data. This is log p versus time. You can see the data form these lines, different lines with different Reynolds number. So I can then work out what this lifetime is as a function of Reynolds number. So here it is. That lifetime increases with the Reynolds number. Except that this is the logarithm of the lifetime. So if it was increasing exponentially, it would just be a straight line. But it's not, it's going up like this. It's increasing faster than exponential. Okay. So these puffs are metastable. They eventually die away. Now you crank up the Reynolds number above about 2040. Now what happens is the puff lives to the other end. And what can happen is the puff can actually make a baby and split into two. Then these daughter puffs then carry on. So I get 2 puffs, or 3 puffs, or 4 puffs, or whatever. And so then I can say, well, how long does it take for a puff to split? Well, the more turbulent it is, the more likely it's going to split because the thing wants to become turbulent. So it wants to create more turbulent puffs. So you'd expect a curve that starts off high up here, and the lifetime, the time between splitting events, gets smaller as the flow becomes more turbulent. And here are the data, and you can see they do. And this is again is the logarithmic how. So the mean time between splitting events also increases faster than exponential. Okay, so then you do something which you have no reason to do. You say, let's take the log of that. Log of lifetime. Both of these curves become straight and they intersect here. This is the critical transition. Why? Because once you're above this point, you have an infinite pipe. There's always going to be a small probability that the puff will split into 2. And so I will have a non-zero fraction of turbulence in the pipe. So that's why you identify that as the critical velocity. Now you might say, taking the double log of something, any quantity, if you take log of log, is bound to be just, it's going to be linear, right? But there's a theoretical reason why this works, which I'm going to show you. So what you've learned so far is the lifetime of turbulence gives us e to the Reynolds number. All time scales go like that. It's insane. Okay? Okay. So now I'll show you the theory. Okay, let's remind ourselves what we've been doing in this class. Okay? What we did on magnets, we said the following. Magnets at small scales is described by quantum mechanics. Then we say, well, forget about quantum mechanics, it's way too hard. We don't want to have to solve the band structure and so on. We'll just look at the dipole moments. So we look at the dipole moments, it gives us an Ising or Heisenberg. But that's quantum mechanical, that's too hard. So let's just throw out the quantum mechanics, let's make it classical. Okay, so you do that, that's still too hard. So then you write down Landau theory. And in Landau theory, you can solve it. You can use a normalization group and things like this. So that's what we did. And we saw how well it worked. So here's the magnetization near TC. You have these weak long wavelength modes that cause magnetizations relatively small. We saw that if you sit at the critical isotherm, the critical temperature, and you measure what happens when I apply an external magnetic field. Normally, you'd say the magnetization would be proportional to the external field. That's Curie's law. That breaks down, and then the response breaks down at the critical point, and it goes like h to the power 1 over delta, where delta is about 3. Beta is about 1/3. And then Widom pointed out that these results come from the similarity formula, which we derived by the normalization group last quarter. And this is the curve I showed you before, showing how well that works. And so you say this is a great success. The Ising model, this shows you that we can make a precise prediction with experiment, but it's very, very weird because this is actually a model of a model of a model of a model of a model that gives you the agreement. Because we started off with quantum chemistry, then electronic band structure, then the quantum Heisenberg model, then classical Heisenberg model, then Landau theory. And then it's that Landau theory that ends up giving us the prediction. Each of the time, each way we go from here to here to here to here, all these different levels of description, all those approximations are mathematically unjustified. There's no systematic approximation scheme that you can do. You cannot work through and find out this is how you derive this. Okay? After you've done the normalization group, you can see that all these other variables are irrelevant operators in the renormalization group sense, as we started discussing last quarter. But you would never know that ahead of time. Okay, so now let's talk about turbulence. Okay, turbulence is way harder than magnet. Okay, in magnetic systems, I cannot start from quantum mechanics and go all the way to the critical experiments. Okay, so we should not expect that in turbulence, I start off with, say, the kinetic theory or the Navier-Stokes equations and derive the critical behavior. So everything that most mathematicians, physicists do says if we're going to understand this problem, we have to start with Navier-Stokes equations. But from the perspective of this course, the Navier-Stokes equations are the worst place to start if you want to understand the critical behavior. The worst place. It'd be like trying to understand the magnetic transition, and you're only allowed to start off with the Schrödinger equation. Okay? So the question, the smart question to us, is what is the analog of Landau theory? And what is the renormalization group universality class? So we're going to construct the Landau theory, and from that, we're going to work out the universality class. Okay, how can you construct Landau theory when you can't do any calculation at all? So you have to do something. So the first thing that's important is, as we know from phase transitions, you need to know what is the order parameter, you need to know what are the long wavelength collective modes at the phase transition. So let's go and look for them. So we're going to do numerical simulations of the Navier-Stokes equations. And we're going to look at these puffs, because these puffs are the objects that are behaving strangely as you go through the critical point. So we're going to take a simulation of Navier-Stokes and we're going to look for puffs. And what we found was this. When we simulated a puff, we discovered that there's two modes that are important. There's the turbulence at small scales, seen here in green, and then there's another mode in the span-wise direction, going this way azimuthally, that I call the zonal flow. This mode, when I plot the energy, the zonal flow and the turbulence, it looks like I get graphs that look like this as a function of time. Where have you seen that before?
Looks like a predator and prey map.
It looks like a predator prey. Okay. So when we saw that, we said, that looks like a predator prey. And this is the structure of this mode. This is the slice through it showing the velocity vectors and so on. Okay. So what's happening is this. The small scale turbulence, if I look at the velocity fluctuations of the turbulence, you can derive this equation from the Navier-Stokes equation. The fluctuations, the radial gradient of those fluctuations generates the flow in the azimuthal direction. Okay. So what happens is this. This object, this is called the Reynolds stress. If the flow is isotropic, turbulence is isotropic, then this correlation function will be zero. So what happens is I have some anisotropic turbulence at small scales. It sort of sends out a burst of fluid that hits the walls of the pipe and then spreads around azimuthally. I didn't know this when we came up with this theory, but this idea that this can happen was already foreseen, not in this context, but in another context, by James Lighthill in 1963, in a paper that nobody knows, nobody remembers. It's very difficult to even find it. Okay, so I have to write another paper connecting what we did with what Lighthill did. Lighthill was a very famous, a brilliant, genius fluid mechanician who actually taught me fluid mechanics at Cambridge. One of the people did. Okay, so let's have a look at what happens. The turbulence this thing creates this zonal flow. And this zonal flow goes round in the azimuthal direction, and it shears the turbulence, bundles it up like this, and makes it more isotropic. So the turbulence induces the zonal flow, and then the zonal flow then shears the turbulence and makes it isotropic, and so suppresses it. Once the turbulence has been suppressed, then the zonal flow, which is created by the turbulence shooting out the fluid to the walls, that goes down, and then now the zonal flow has gone away, now the turbulence can go up again. So this is exactly like you were saying, predator and prey in an ecosystem. So now it's very easy. You can probably guess what's going to happen. So now we say, let's make a model of predator and prey in an ecosystem. So we know from what I told you before, the way you describe predator and prey in an ecosystem is not by differential equations. You write down the stochastic theory, because there is no sensible deterministic limit of the stochastic theory. So you have to write down the stochastic theory. The stochastic theory gives you these oscillations, as we talked about before. And so now you work out what is the field theory for the predator prey. Okay, so I'm not going to do the algebra, but here's what happens. The solid lines here are the zonal flows. The wiggly lines are the turbulence. I've got the Navier-Stokes equations, which have got du by dt plus u dot grad u equals linear stuff. So the nonlinearity in the Navier-Stokes equations is a vertex, which will have three things coming from it. So the first person to write down field theoretic description of Navier-Stokes equations was Bill Wild at the University of Illinois, an energy physicist. And so you can do the same thing here for wave turbulence. You can take the zonal flow and the turbulence, write down all the possible diagrams that you would get from this. So let's have a look at this diagram. This one says turbulence meets the zonal flow, something happens, and out comes two zonal flows. The zonal flow is the predator. Turbulence is the prey. So this is the sort of wave picture of the system. There's a wave particle duality. Let's have a look at the particle picture of this. This says the predator, which is the zonal flow, meets the prey, and with some probability kills the prey and then produces a baby predator. So I get A plus B goes to A plus A. That was exactly what we talked about in the first part of this lecture. So these diagrams represent a predator-prey model just by having these modes. Okay, so now I'm going to simulate that predator-prey model. So this is the data on pipe flow turbulence. This over here is the phase diagram of a predator-prey ecosystem in a pipe. Okay, in this case, a two-dimensional pipe. The analog of the Reynolds number is the prey birth rate. Think about it like this. Suppose the sheep make babies once every 100 years. Okay, so the wolves come along, eat all the sheep, everything dies, nothing's going to happen. Okay, if on the other hand, the sheep make babies once every 15 minutes, then the wolves come along, they eat the sheep, but then the sheep make more babies, and so you can have predator-prey coexistence. So the prey birth rate is like the Reynolds number. When the prey birth rate is too slow, everything dies, you just go around there. And then when the prey birth rate is high, you get coexistence of laminar and turbulence. Okay? So here you do a simulation, you make a decaying population, predator and prey. In this range it decays, in this range you've got this resplittings. Okay, so here's a picture. This is space and time. This is the prey intensity, which is the turbulence intensity. You can see it splits. Here are simulation data from solving direct numerical simulations of Navier-Stokes. The same thing, this is time, this is space. Turbulence intensity. So you get so this phase here is the phase where the puff comes along and it splits into two, and splits into two again, and so on and so forth. And the same thing is happening there. So now you can say, well, let's simulate predator-prey, but let's measure the statistical extinction time at the time between the population splitting events. Just like I showed you, the experimentalists have done for turbulence in a real pipe. So here are the data. So one of these is the turbulence. This one is the turbulence, and this one is the ecosystem one. Time versus Reynolds number. Here you can see this upward curvature, the super exponential behavior, e to the Reynolds number. Here you see the birth rates, the time. Again, you see the super exponential behavior as you see it again. So you can see that we can reproduce all the data that was measured, mysterious data of the laminar turbulence transition, with a theory that has nothing to do with Navier-Stokes. Okay, that theory was just Prey. They never ever saw Navier-Stokes equations. It was just a stochastic simulation of Prey in an ecosystem, and it reproduces phase diagram and it reproduces the insanely weird statistics of the transition. Okay. So the extinction ecology is the death of turbulence. Okay. So what I've told you so far, I started with turbulence. I find that there's a kind of two-fluid model of the transition. I notice that that two-fluid model behaves like a present Prey. The thing I want to know is, what does it mean in the Hamilton class? Is there a phase transition? And if so, what is it? Okay. Now I'm going to show you that that phase transition is directed percolation. And I'm going to show you that by taking this, writing down its field theory, showing that the field theory is the field theory of this process. So let's have a look and see how that happens. So what is directed percolation? So you do this every morning, at least I do. Okay, you make a cup of coffee. So you have a conical filter, you put coffee grinds in, you pour in the water, the water drips through the coffee grinds and goes into your cup. Okay, so what you do is you put the coffee in, pour the water in. What happens is the water trickles through, you've got a cup of coffee, you taste it, and it tastes disgusting. It's like the cups of coffee you get at a petrol station, at a gas station. Okay, they're useless, or really horrible. So then you say, okay, fine, well, that's really bad. So obviously I should make the water, the space between the grains is very big. The water can easily trickle through. It doesn't spend long enough inside the coffee grains to absorb all the coffee taste and stuff. So then you pack it together really tightly, then you pour the water in, and then what happens is the water backs up and goes all over the table and you make a huge mess, and then your wife yells at you, and your dog yells at you, and the children yells at you, and it doesn't work, and the coffee cup is empty. Okay. So then you say, fine, okay, let's just make the coffee grains to be, not too tight, but not too loose either. You can think of it as a probability of P. We're going from here to here to here. And what you want to do is you want to make it as long as possible for the water to get through the coffee granules in order to be able to absorb those most of the coffee flavor. But if it goes through too fast, then it won't absorb any at all. Okay. Now, if you look at the trajectories here, so there's a probability P that you can get through. If you look at all these diagrams, these trajectories, you can see that they represent these different processes. So, for example, you get annihilation. You start off over here, but then you don't get through. You don't get through to the other side. Or you can have decoagulation. You start off here, and you hop to this one, and you hop to this one. You both those get it. Or you can have diffusion, where it just hops through like this. Or you can have coagulation, where two of these go into one. So all of those four basic diagrams gives you every possible picture you can have for directed percolation. Okay, so there's a phase transition. This is the coffee phase transition. So this is the water backing up and everybody shouting at you. This is gas station coffee, and this is the perfect cup of coffee. Okay, and then you ask, well, if I go to long times, then now think about the occupied sites as being turbulence. Okay? So here there's no turbulence. Here there's lots of turbulence, and then near the transition there's just a little bit of turbulence. So this is the turbulent fraction, and there's P minus PC just on critical exponent. And there's other exponents as well, but I'm not going to tell you them. So now said, okay, fine, we can do a very cheap simulation of the transition to turbulence. So the green pixels are turbulent, they represent a puff, and then it's gradually going to decay away. This is what it looks like. It just decays away to nothing. Let's suppose I took a cross section through the puff and look at it like this. So I'm less than the critical Reynolds number, less than the critical percolation. I'm just simulating directed percolation, not Navier-Stokes. I start off with all these sites being occupied, and then gradually I follow this thing here, then it stops being occupied. If blue is no longer occupied by turbulence. And eventually, the longest trajectory here is the lifetime of the turbulent path, the last path that you see going out there. So the active state, a turbulent state, persists until the most long-lived percolating strands decays. So the longest path is the maximum among these independent randomly percolating paths. So that tells you that this is a problem in extreme value statistics. So what is extreme value statistics? Suppose I have a bunch of random variables, and I say, bunch of random variables, what is the, if I add them all together, what is the behavior of the average? Okay, the answer is what? What's the theorem called in mathematics? Got a bunch of random variables, and I ask for the probability distribution of the sum of those random variables.
Random walk.
It is a random walk, but what's the theorem called that tells you the statistics? John, you should know. You're a mathematician. I have a bunch of random variables and I add them together. What is the probability distribution of them? What?
Oh, yeah.
What is it? Central limit theorem. Okay, it should be a Gaussian, right? That's true. And you can prove that by the normalization group. Gauss's derivation of that, he didn't do it this way, but that's the first example of universality. Every random process has the same distribution when you aggregate them. But now we're looking at extreme value statistics because we want to know the statistics of the longest path. So we're looking at the max of a bunch of random variables. When we do that, what is that? There's three fixed points of the renormalization group transformation. And the one that's the relevant one here is this one called the Fisher-Tippett-Gumbel distribution. And the distribution gives us e to the minus e to the minus 1. That's where the e to the Reynolds number comes from. Basically comes from that. Okay. And I'll tell you what the universality class is. So let's write down what is a prey, A is pressure, B is the prey, E is empty site or energy, I and J are space vectors. These things hop around. These are the stochastic equations for the whole system, the ones that we were solving that gave us the behavior that looked exactly like the experiment. Let's suppose we're very near the transition. Okay, so the prey population is small, so the predator population is even smaller. So we'll just take out the predator population, set A equal to 0. Then I have these four processes written down as particle processes. And if I write these things down diagrammatically, they look like this. Annihilation, death, birth, decoagulation, B plus E goes to B plus B, and so on. So what I've just shown you, but just graphically, is that near the extinction transition, stochastic predatory dynamics reduces to directed percolation. And you can prove this by path integrals as well. But this is the physics of it. Okay, so that's why that was our prediction. Okay, so here's the experimental test. So that we published this in 2016, Nature Physics, in the same issue. Hoff group did an experiment in a pipe that is circular. So here is a Taylor coed system. So the outside cylinder rotates. There's an inner cylinder, and the fluid is in between the two cylinders. I look along a little window, and I just measure. I look and see what color is the fluid as it goes past. The fluid has little particles in it. Those particles, there's a laser beam pointing in, and particles reflect the light. If the fluid is laminar, then the particles line up with the flow, so then they reflect the light back into your eyes, and you see something which is bright. If the fluid is random, then they're pointing in random directions, it's turbulent, and so then the light doesn't come back into your eyes, and so it's black. So these are the puffs in this one-dimensional pipe with periodic boundary conditions. I take these pictures. This is the first rotation, then the second one, and the third one. Take these pictures, stack them up one underneath each other like this. And then this is what you get. So below the critical transition, the blue is the turbulent, the yellow is the laminar. You can see this looks just like directed percolation. I can measure the critical exponents. They're exactly those that you can predict from directed percolation. And let me just show you. I probably have it somewhere here. Yeah, I do. So that's what I just showed you. If I take the predator-free system do the same thing, plot out the roll lines of the thing, and also produce directed percolation, just as we predicted. Okay. So then you can measure. Then can you see predator-prey dynamics? Well, the first person who predicted about predator-prey was Pat Diamond, not in pipe flow, but in magnesial hydrodynamics and tokamaks. And he made this prediction in the 1984. And it was like until 2012 they were able to observe these things in the tokamak. So you have the same thing. The turbulence goes along like this, and then there's a mode that goes around the outside. So you can see these things. And so that's how you can know that the turbulence transition is in the non-equilibrium universality class of directed percolation. Okay, I'll tell you one other thing, then I'll quit. If I take the Reynolds number just a little bit higher, then these puffs actually start to spread out to fill the pipe with turbulence. So it looks like this. As you can see here, it starts to spread. So you can make a theory of that. And then what you do is you include the mean shear between the puffs. And I'm not going to go through how you do that, but what you end up doing is predicting that there's 4 different modes. Well, there's the puff, and there's a thing called a slug, which has 1 active front and 1 tail, and a strong slug, which has two strong fronts. And the mathematical theory of that predicts that. I want to show you that. But it's not in this. Really, it's not in this talk. Well, I'll show you this. Not here. So what you do is you make another ecosystem level. You include the energy of the flow into your model. And I don't have the slides for it here, but it doesn't matter. So then it turns out that you can make a model that describes both the pipe and the collect. And what's different about them is in one the flow is shear driven. So I've got a shear between the inner and the layer. This one is driven by pressure. So if I think about it in terms of where the energy is flowing from the left, this one, and flowing through the walls in this one. So when you do that, you can then use the ecosystem model to simulate what happens in the periodic pipe thing. And that's what you get. And that was in a official letter from Cheyenne in my group about 2 years ago. Okay, and this is all stuff that's unpublished. Okay, so I think that's where I'm going to stop. Any questions?
I guess like it's still the same question. How do you know like whether a physics system can make analogy with the predator prey?
Well, you shouldn't. Well, that's the wrong question, right? You don't. So the way you solve physics problems is you don't say, "I've got a hammer. Let me go looking for a nail." Okay. So it just turns out some of these problems are like that. Well, not every problem is, okay? The problem you're working on to do with emergence in large language models, I don't have any reason to believe that that's going to turn out to be like a predator prey, or maybe we'll find that it does. So the message isn't that everything is predator prey. The message is you want to start thinking about the different levels of description and what is the right level to be thinking about.
Yeah. Like how did the first man like find the connection between the turbulence between them? I feel like it's not very obvious, right?
It's not very obvious, but I had a suspicion that this would be true because you know, we went looking for it. I mean, so when we did the numerical simulations, we didn't know what we were going to find. And I certainly knew that if it was predator prey, it would end up being directed percolation, because I already knew that result from path integrals. But you know, it could have turned out not to be true, and there's plenty of people who still don't believe it. That's the mechanism, but because it's very hard to observe this experimentally. So so you don't know. The whole thing about doing physics is if you know lots of different things and you see something, you say, "Aha! I know where that comes from," and you can connect it. So that's not an algorithm. You have to be thinking about science all the
Stop
time.
remembering where you put all of your different hammers.
Remember where you put all your different hammers. That's right. That's right. So, and in fact, the problem that Guru is working on is very interesting because in that problem there's no puffs, and yet we still see directed percolation because our theory doesn't say so. So in the paper that we just published in Nature Physics, and by the way, there's a description of it on the university website right today, I think. But in that calculation, we looked at puffs and pretended they were point particles, and then we worked out the field theory for that. And we also predicted that they have traffic jams, and they do, and we observed the traffic jams in the experiments. So most people think that the reason it's directed percolation is because puffs are point-like particles. But if you have no puffs, you still have directed percolation. So you don't need so you have to look at these long wavelength modes. You have to understand what you're doing in looking at phase transitions, and then because you know about it, then you can look for things that other people wouldn't have noticed. And remember, we were the only people really who were doing statistical mechanics looking at this at the transition. So the skill is choosing the problem so that the things that you have in your toolkit might be relevant. But we kind of suspected it, and Yves Pomeau, who's another member of our turbulence collaboration, back in 1986, he had some reason for thinking it might be directed percolation. And his reasoning was kind of strange. And actually, when we wrote our paper in Nature Physics, the first one. And Bjorn published the experiments that they ran a special issue on turbulence, and they invited Yves to write a commentary, and he said, well, he's not sure that it really would be directed percolation, because you have to look at the physics of the interactions between the parts. But now we've done the paper we've just published shows that it is still directed percolation. So
That's wonderful. Thank you.
any other questions?
I was just gonna say, like the observing of the turbulence in the Taylor light flow of seeing the dark spots and the light spots after like irradiating it. I have done that experiment in
Really?
a pool.
Really?
Yeah, because if you move your hand back and forth really quickly,
Yeah.
you can make some turbulence.
Yeah.
And if you look
Yeah.
through, it becomes a dark spot.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which I just
Yeah.
I was laughing if you couldn't.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I was like,
Yeah.
oh, I've done that before.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I just thought that was funny.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of non-trivial physics that all comes together to understand this emergent thing of turbulence. Biology, statistical mechanics, normalization group theory, fluid mechanics, lots of very complicated and clever experiments. So the student who worked on this, Huang Yan, who's now a professor at Academia Sinica in Taiwan, she was working on this rapid evolution that I talked about at the beginning of today's lecture. And then she wanted to work on the turbulence problem, so we started working on that. So halfway through her PhD thesis, we realized that the two problems that she was working on were actually the same. The predator prey and the turbulence were the same thing. So her thesis won the APS dissertation award. It's a very unique thing. Okay, I'm going to turn off the recording and